Good evening and welcome. I'm Azazel, and tonight is the first installment in a new series that I plan to run alongside my Ghostly Japan series. I'm calling it Ghostly Stories. These will be audiobook-style videos of stories with a paranormal theme. Tonight's inaugural episode is an original work of fiction by yours truly. Originally posted to the No Sleep subreddit, this story deals with the unexpected consequences of a paranormal encounter in one's past. I humbly submit for your listening enjoyment, my apology. I've made a horrible mistake. This is as much for posterity as it is an apology. I hope you know how terribly sorry I am. Where do I start? I'm sitting in my daughter's room recording this, as she's packing her things, but she's not doing it with the urgency she should. She's humming as she picks a blouse out of her chest of drawers and puts it in her suitcase. The bliss of being a child. As her father, I don't want her to be afraid. No father wants their child to feel fear, but I am afraid. More afraid than I have been in a long time. I tried to explain that she needs to hurry without worrying her, but it's no use. She doesn't understand. So I bide my frustration and keep a wary eye on the darkness in the hallway. I'm not making sense. Let me start at the beginning. 15 years ago when I met Sarah. It was at the end of my sophomore year at university that I met Sarah. I had avoided taking a communications class until this point due to my crippling fear of public speaking and general social awkwardness. But the department advisor for the major I was hoping to get accepted into had said it would help my chances, so I bit the bullet and took the class. It was here that I met Sarah. She was a year ahead of me and personality-wise was just the opposite of me. She was confident and outgoing, but she had an intensity that some might find overbearing. I found it endearing. By pure chance, I took the empty chair next to her on the first day of class. Maybe it was fate. As I sat next to her, she turned her head and gave me a once-over. Without introducing herself, immediately she asked if I had seen Tool in concert. I was wearing a Tool band t-shirt on that day. I told her I had not, and she began to tell me in great detail about the last concert of theirs she had been to. I mostly just sat, listened, and nodded my head at the appropriate time until class started. And that was the way it was between us for the next few weeks. We talked, well, more she talked and I listened, about music, TVs, movies, etc. As it turned out, we had quite a bit in common. We both had an interest in the paranormal too, and often talked of our love for trashy ghost hunting shows. I didn't learn her name until the second week of class. For the insecure, awkward dork that I was at the time, I didn't care that the conversations were mostly one-sided. All that mattered was this girl seemed to enjoy talking with me. When it came time to partner up with a classmate for our first class project, it was a foregone conclusion that we would choose each other. For the partner project, we would need to meet outside of school, and unfortunately, both Sarah and I had part-time jobs that took up most of our free time. I worked at a large chain big box retailer on the swing shift most days after school and didn't get off until late. Sarah, on the other hand, worked 2 12s on the weekends on the graveyard shift, which unfortunately meant she needed to sleep during the day on the weekend. There wasn't really any obvious overlapping free time that worked for both of us. Sarah thought about it for a moment and then asked if I'd consider coming to her work on the weekends to work on the project. She explained she worked as a security guard in a building downtown and that while she wasn't technically supposed to have visitors, she was the only guard there, so no one would know. I said I was game. Truth be told, I didn't need any convincing. I had started to develop a crush on Sarah by this point, and the prospect of getting to spend the whole night with her, just the two of us, was too exciting to decline. She said she worked 6 to 6, and that by 10 everyone else would have cleared out, so I was welcome to drop by any time after that. It was a date. I'd get off from my own job around 10:30, and then I'd head over to her work that Friday. I had no idea what I was setting in motion. That Friday night I left work, changing in the parking lot from my work shirt to something a little more casual, and then I headed off to Sarah's work. When I arrived at the address, I couldn't believe it. I was sitting in my car outside a 30-story, sleek, modern-looking skyscraper. Clearly, I had gotten the address wrong as I looked down at the map I had printed off. Maybe I had misheard Sarah when she told me the address over the phone, so I rang her up on my cell to confirm. She responded by telling me that she could see me on the external security cameras and to bring my car around to the below-ground parking garage entrance and she would let me in. I was stunned as I drove my car in. I couldn't believe they really would leave such a large building in the hands of a single person. Sarah was waiting for me in front of the parking garage elevators, wearing her security blazer. I asked again if this was really okay. Wouldn't we get in trouble? She explained that as long as nothing happened that would give her bosses reason to check the security camera recordings, that we were fine. The footage would get wiped every 48 hours, and her supervisor only rarely ever checked in on her in person. Since most of the tenants were white-collar workers, there rarely was anyone there after 10 on the weekends. Her only responsibilities were to let the odd tenant into the building after hours for emergencies, and to let the delivery people in around 4. However, from 10 to 4, she was queen of a giant skyscraper, all by herself. She insisted on giving me the grand tour before we got down to the business of working on our class project. As we stepped out of the elevator and onto the main floor, I was overwhelmed. The main floor was actually a large 2-floor atrium. The top floor was the main floor with the couches and the meeting spaces, the admin offices, bathrooms, and of course the Main Street access entrances. The bottom floor of the atrium had a popular chain coffee shop, a cafe, and a gift shop. The 2 floors were connected by an escalator. Then there was a bank of elevators that led to the floors above us. It was surreal walking around the atrium. This space normally was full of people and bustling with the sounds of business, but instead it was empty and eerily quiet except for the hum of the building's machinery. Next, she led me to the elevator bank and explained that a number of the floors were taken up by a large legal firm. While they didn't have any security guards, they did have their own security cameras, so she didn't want to get out on those floors. The other floors, which had smaller businesses, contracted their security work to the company Sarah worked for, so she had the keys to their offices. She led us up to the break room of a small local insurance company. She said they had the best snacks and coffee, as she made us a couple of cups. After we finished her snacks and coffee, she took me to the 13th floor, which had been vacant for as long as she had worked there. We walked through the open, empty floor, peering out of the glass windows onto the streets below us. She said she had it in her mind that one day she'd throw a party here with her friends. She then took us up to the roof. It was an amazing view, probably one of the best in the city. Surreal is really the only way to describe it. Here was this skyscraper, and the only souls in it were the 2 of us. Sarah led us back down to the main floor, to the admin offices, which had a conference room which she said would be the best place for us to work on our project. There was a long wooden table with plush leather executive chairs, and at the front a massive projector screen. It was overkill for a 100-level communications class project. Around 3 in the morning, we retired out to the lobby to relax. We sat on the couches, chatting while sipping on some coffee from the security break room. We were done working on the project for the night since there was only about an hour before the delivery folk would start to show up, and Sarah had suggested it best that I leave before then. I don't remember exactly what we had been talking about, but I remember I had been mid-sentence when I heard a loud ding echo across the atrium from the elevator bank, followed by the unmistakable sound of elevator doors opening. I felt my heart race as I thought we were about to be caught on my very first time here. I looked to Sarah expecting her to be motioning me to hide, but instead, she was just staring straight at me, completely relaxed, and grinning deviously. I didn't understand it at all. I looked past her across the atrium toward the elevators, to see as plain as day a young girl, probably no older than 8, with straight black shoulder-length hair and wearing a black and white plaid sundress with black trim and a black bow on the waist. She leaned out from behind the elevator looking straight at me, then disappeared back into the elevator. I immediately looked at Sarah, and before I could say anything, she said, "You saw one of them, didn't you?" She eagerly asked me to describe what I had seen, and as I described the little girl, she nodded knowingly. She told me how relieved she was to hear that I had seen the little girl. She had seen her as well, and was starting to wonder if she was going crazy. She explained that she had seen a number of ghosts in the building and come to think of them in jest as her coworkers. She didn't dare mention it to her boss, though, unless they thought she was mentally unstable and sacked her. She refrained from describing the other ghosts. She wanted to hold off until I had seen them first. She felt it was important to see if we were seeing the same thing. I was astonished as I sat and listened, but before we could get any further into the subject, Sarah glanced at her watch and saw that it was nearly 4. On the drive home, I kept replaying the events of the night in my head. Despite my interest in the paranormal, I had never before had an experience of my own. By the same token, I couldn't entirely rule out that Sarah was playing a prank on me. The image of the girl was seared into my mind. She wasn't see-through or misty like in those ghost hunting shows I watched. In fact, when I first saw the little girl, my first reaction had been that she was a real live human being. The idea of a ghost hadn't even crossed my mind. But then again, which was stranger? A little ghost girl, or that somehow Sarah had arranged for an 8-year-old girl to step out of an elevator downtown at 3 a.m. for the purpose of a prank? I came back the next night to ostensibly continue working on our class project, but really, all I wanted to do was talk about the little ghost girl. Unfortunately, nothing happened. I think Sarah was disappointed as well. All the following week, I picked her brain in class about the ghosts at her work. She said she had been working at that site for almost a year, and she had seen the first ghost on her second day of the job. I asked her if she was afraid, and she hesitated before saying she had been startled a few times, but they hadn't given any reason to fear them. I went back again the following weekend. This time I had another experience. It was around 2 a.m. when I left the conference room to go use the restroom. The restroom was down a long L-shaped hallway. When I finished my business and stepped back out into the hallway, the little ghost girl was standing at the end of the bend in the L. She looked at me briefly before turning and walking out of sight. It was now or never, if I was ever going to dispel the possibility that this was all a prank. I immediately sprinted down the hallway after the little girl. There was no way she would be able to outrun me. When I turned the corner, there was no one to be seen. A chill ran down my spine as I accepted that this was the real deal. When I got back to the conference room, I told Sarah about what had just happened. Sarah's face lit up as she listened, but said it was too bad it wasn't one of the other spirits. I was now spending all of my weekend nights with Sarah at her workplace. It wasn't long before Sarah got her wish, and I had my first run-in with the other security guard. I had been walking with Sarah on her nightly patrol through the building. She had to touch an electronic baton to certain stations to prove she was there. There were touch stations on the floors that the large legal firm occupied. Not wanting to show up on the law firm's security cameras, I went ahead to the 13th floor to wait for her. I was standing at one of the large glass windows admiring the nighttime view of the city when I heard the rustling of keys. It was the same sound Sarah made on her patrol since she carried a large ring of keys with her. But as I turned expecting to see Sarah, instead, I saw a man wearing a security uniform entering from the stairway carrying a flashlight and with keys clipped to his belt. My immediate thought was that this was Sarah's boss, who had come to check on her in person for some reason. I needed to hide fast. But the floor being vacant, there were no desks or cubicles to hide in. I looked around frantically, and the only spot I could find was a closet in one of the corner offices. I quickly but quietly made my way into the closet and pulled the closet door almost all the way closed. I didn't close it all the way, though, because I was afraid the sound of the locking mechanism in the door closing would be too loud. Plus, this allowed me to peek through the thin slit between the door and the frame to spy on Sarah's boss as he walked by. It wasn't long before the man came walking by, whistling as he did. He shined the flashlight quickly into the office across the hallway and then into the one I was in, and moved on whistling all the way. It seemed like he was just making the rounds. I noticed his uniform seemed hilariously out of date. He didn't wear the slim black security blazer that Sarah did, but a garish gray and orange button-up shirt with a comically large collar. Frankly, he looked like he had just stepped out of the 70s. I suspected I had just encountered another of Sarah's so-called co-workers. I opened the door of the closet, and that must have created a small gust because a bunch of papers that had been left on one of the higher shelves in the closet came showering down on top of me. As I bent over to collect them, I noticed that they were highly unusual papers. They all appeared to be handwritten in an Asian script. I thought they might be Japanese since they looked familiar to what I had seen on some anime. Even though they were each handwritten, all the papers had the same identical sequence of characters written on them. There was a strange Asian gate-looking thing at the top of each one drawn in red ink. Sarah finally caught up to me while I was picking up the papers. I showed them to her. Sarah knew some basic Japanese and was able to point out that the characters across the top were the numbers 0 through 9. The letters below it were the Japanese alphabet. The only words on the paper were yes and no. Looking at the paper, she stated that it must be some type of Ouija board. Neither of us had a good explanation for why they were there. Eventually, the quarter ended, and even though there wasn't any class project that needed collaborating on, I kept spending my weekend evenings at Sarah's work. Over that summer, our relationship evolved into a romantic one. Most of our dates were at Sarah's work. We had our movie nights, streaming movies from a laptop onto the projector screen in the conference room. Dinner dates were delivery, eaten in the empty dining area of the cafe. We danced in the lobby of the atrium, playing music over the lobby's PA system. I would encounter the rest of Sarah's co-workers that summer. On the roof was a woman in office casual dress, with a forlorn expression, who would jump over the side of the building, only to vanish. Then there was a man in gray coveralls who would appear in any number of the hallways. He would walk by and vanish around corners. He always seemed upset about something, but I couldn't make out what he was grumbling about. Then there was always the little girl I had seen that first night, always meekly peeking out at us from behind corners. She seemed to be the only one aware of our presence. The others paid us no attention, and only seemed to repeat their loops. I also met Sarah's living friends. Encouraged by my reaction to seeing the ghosts, namely that I hadn't gone running for the hills, she was emboldened to bring her friends to her work. We quickly learned that not everyone seemed to be able to perceive the ghosts. Few saw the same full-body apparitions as Sarah and I. Some only experienced sounds, rapidly moving shadows, or sensations. And then there were those who didn't see or hear anything at all out of the ordinary. One such friend was Kate, a longtime friend of Sarah's. She seemed amused when we told her of the ghosts. Her boyfriend Vince, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable in the building. He didn't admit to seeing anything, but said he heard strange noises in the building and frequently commented on how creepy the building was without anyone in it. Then there were those who had very negative reactions to the building. I recall one time when two sisters, friends of Sarah's, came to the building one night. We were sitting down in the conference room to eat some takeout the sisters had brought. One of the sisters excused herself to go use the restroom. All we heard was a blood-curdling scream, followed by the girl running back into the room, screaming at her sister in Spanish. The only word I recognized was Diablo. She grabbed her sister and they both practically sprinted out the front doors of the building. The sisters never came back. Further, they refused to even talk to Sarah again after that night. This was exactly the sort of reaction she had feared. That summer, a crew formed centered around Vince, Kate, and one of my friends, Peter. In our group, Sarah and I were the only ones who saw the ghost regularly. Vince and Peter heard noises, although Peter wasn't entirely sure the noises didn't have a logical explanation. And of course, Kate was our resident skeptic. I moved into Sarah's apartment during my junior year, and we kept all hanging out at Sarah's work on the weekends. We still had our run-ins with the ghosts, but we came to simply accept the paranormal activity as normal. Sure, it was sometimes creepy, but no one felt threatened, and the building was just too cool of a hangout spot. Plus, if we hung out somewhere else, Sarah wouldn't have been able to join us. Everything was fine until the birthday party incident that winter. Sarah had wanted to throw a party using the empty 13th floor for a while, and with Kate's birthday, she got her chance. It being Kate's birthday, there were a number of Kate's friends who had never been to Sarah's work before. Most of them did not know anything about the supposed haunting beforehand. All total, there were 23 people that had come, including ourselves. Even though it had been her idea in the first place, Sarah was a little nervous, thinking we were pushing our luck with so many people in the building at one time. Vince and I brought in a couple of kegs of beer, along with snacks, pizzas, supplies, and a birthday cake for Kate, ahead of the arrival of most of the guests. We staged everything in the kitchenette on the 13th floor. People started showing up at about 11, with Sarah ushering them quickly into the parking garage. Everything started off swimmingly. Sarah, Peter, and I met with Kate's friends in the lobby. They were all very friendly and amazed by the building. There were two international student friends of Kate's, Dieter and his girlfriend Annika, who were very friendly and helpful in carrying gifts, chairs, and folding tables up from the lobby. We also brought up one of the mobile projector units that were stored in the conference room so we could watch some movies. Sarah had also brought a Ouija board that she thought would be good for a bit of fun. I didn't think anything of it at the time. All in all, I have to say we set up a pretty amazing birthday party for Kate, and with a killer view of the city to boot. It seemed like Kate's friends thought so as well, and the party seemed to be going pretty well. We couldn't completely abandon the downstairs lobby in case a tenant showed up needing to get in though, and since Kate was Sarah's longtime friend, I offered to Sarah that I'd stay downstairs and let her know if someone showed up, so that she could be there for the party. She gave me a handheld radio set from the security office so that I could radio up to her if there were any issues. Peter came down for a little while to hang out with me and then went back up. Sarah popped down and brought me some food and a beer and gave me a kiss and thanked me for holding down the fort. By all accounts, the party upstairs was going well. At around 2:30 or so, the handheld radio started clicking strangely, followed by a strange, distorted moaning. It was honestly very creepy. I didn't know if the set was malfunctioning or if this was something to do with our paranormal friends. I debated whether it warranted interrupting Sarah. I was just about to try and radio her when the elevators sounded and people started coming down and leaving. They seemed uncomfortable and walked with a briskness that belied their urgent desire to leave. Something was wrong. Sarah's voice broke through on the radio. She was on the verge of tears and wanted me to come up immediately. When I stepped out onto the 13th floor, Sarah was waiting for me as the doors opened. The lights were on and the music had stopped. About half of the guests were gone, and those that were left were cloistered in small groups talking in hushed tones with each other. Annika was in a fetal position sobbing with Dieter trying to comfort her. The air was fetid and thick. Sarah, fighting back tears, said, "It's all my fault." She explained that she had brought out the Ouija board and had told the guests about the building being haunted, which had elicited more than a few snickers apparently. They had set up the Ouija board on one of the folding tables with Kate, Sarah, Annika, and Dieter first up. The rest of the guests arrayed around them watching the demonstration. Dieter had found the whole thing very amusing and began by asking the spirit if it had a monster dong. Nothing happened. There were apparently a few groans from the crowd who wanted to get back to dancing. Sarah then asked if the spirit was someone who had died on the premises. The planchette moved to no. There were doubts cast by the group that someone, namely Dieter, was moving the planchette. Dieter protested and claimed he had not. Sarah then asked the spirit what its name was. The planchette again began to move, and Annika and Kate accused Dieter of moving the planchette. Dieter took his hands off the planchette, again protesting his innocence. The planchette shot violently and deliberately to A. Now there were no hands on the planchette. The group stood in stunned silence. Then it dashed to Z, then rocketed back to A. Before the planchette could move again, Annika flipped the table over with a terrible scream and then began to sob. A few of the spectators stepped forward to inspect the table, loudly proclaiming that there must be some sort of mechanism on the underside of the table controlling the planchette. When they found nothing to explain what everyone had seen, the mood turned fearful, and people started to leave. As I held Sarah trying to comfort her, telling her what had transpired wasn't her fault, Vince and Peter tried to lighten the mood. One of them turned the music back on and encouraged people to come back into the group and dance. Kate suggested they watch a movie instead, and that sounded like as good a plan as any, since no one seemed to be in the dancing mood. The group sat on the carpeted floor and watched one of Kate's favorite movies, Breakfast at Tiffany's. Things seemed to get back to normal for a while as the group sat huddled together watching the movie and drinking beer. About midway through the movie, Peter got up to use the restroom. There was a yelp from the men's room a short while later, and Peter came stumbling out, visibly shaking. I got up and went to him, and he looked at me with a fear in his eyes I had never seen before. I asked him what had happened. He said, "I saw it, dude. I saw it." I asked him which one of the ghosts he had seen. Well, he had never seen one of them before. We had described them before to him in detail. He shook his head and said it wasn't any of them. He kept looking at the bathroom door, like he was expecting something to come out of the doors. He turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, man. I'm out. That thing ain't no ghost, dude. It's not safe here, man." He walked directly towards the elevators, shaking his head the entire way, repeating, "Nope, nope, nope," over and over. I stood there like an idiot as the elevator doors closed. "You should leave too," he shouted as the doors shut. He never came back after that night. I went back to the group and sat down next to Sarah. She asked what had happened with Peter, and all I could say was he had left. We continued watching the film until all of a sudden the projector froze on a scene of Audrey Hepburn's face, and the image distorted with strange shades of black and blue spreading across her face. Frankly, it made her look a bit like a corpse. The audio got stuck in a strange loop with heavy distortion that sounded similar to the sound I had heard on the radio earlier in the night. Any other night, I think we would have just accepted that the movie file had gotten corrupted somehow. But given what had taken place already that night, it soured whatever good spirit was left in the group. The rest of the guests began getting up and making excuses to Kate that it was time for them to leave. It was obvious to everyone that the party was done now. Dieter and Annika stayed behind with us to clean up. No one wanted to be alone anywhere in the building for the rest of the night. After the birthday party, things started to change. Only Vince and Kate would come to visit with us at Sarah's work, but even the skeptic, Kate, refused to go above the main lobby and seemed uncomfortable being alone in the building for any length of time. Sarah's changes were more profound and troubling. She became increasingly obsessed with the paranormal, the occult, and learning all that she could about the history of the building, to the detriment of her schoolwork. Instead of studying for midterms or finals, she was poring over microfilm of newspapers looking for clues to the identities of the ghosts. She failed half her winter quarter classes, barely passed the other half. Spring quarter, she failed them all. She lost interest in talking about anything other than the paranormal. That intensity that I had found endearing when I first met her was now corrupted into this all-consuming obsession with the paranormal. I was deeply uncomfortable going to her work now, but I didn't want her there by herself. I especially hated waiting for her on the 13th floor when she did her patrols. I didn't dare walk around at all. I stood right next to the elevators until Sarah caught up to me, but standing up there, by myself, I swore I could hear something skittering around in those corner offices. I asked Peter a number of times what he had seen the night of the birthday party, and he refused to talk about it. All he would say was that we needed to get out of there, that it wasn't really what it appeared to us as, and the fact that it was disguising itself was a major red flag. I implored Sarah to quit her job. I told her that I could even support her temporarily until she could get another part-time job, but she said she couldn't put that burden on me. By late summer, her personal hygiene was starting to take a toll as well from neglect. Kate, Vince, and I staged an intervention of sorts, and of course, because she refused to quit that stupid job, we had to do it in the lobby of that cursed building. Kate tried to reach her as a longtime friend, telling her that she didn't recognize the friend she had known since middle school, that Sarah was throwing away her future and her life chasing ghosts. As her boyfriend, I told her that I loved her and saw a possible future for us, but that future couldn't include ghosts in this goddamn building. Vince mostly just stood there. Sarah seemed genuinely wounded by her statements. She then pulled a binder out of her book bag that was full of newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. She said she was so close to discovering the truth. She shoved the clippings in front of us. She showed an old news story about a maintenance worker who had died in a freak accident while working on the elevator, a yellowed obituary for a woman who had taken her life by jumping from the roof, and a copy of a microfilm record of a security guard who had died from unspecified causes working the graveyard shift. But there's no record for a child ever dying in this building. None at all. She doesn't belong here, she exclaimed. I don't know what reaction she expected from us, but we just stared silently at her. She sat back into her couch, defeated. Fine, I'll quit. The last few weeks of summer, things seemed to get better. She started taking care of herself again. She would mention things other than the ghosts at her work. She had put her 2 weeks in, so even though she was still working in that building, there was light at the end of the tunnel. The first week of fall quarter of my senior year, and what was supposed to be her 5th year, things came crashing down. That very first day of fall quarter, we both walked to campus together and then went to our respective classes. We both had morning and early afternoon classes on opposite ends of campus, but the plan was to meet back up for lunch. When I got to my first class, I realized I had made a small mistake. Instead of signing up for the morning slot, I had actually signed up for the evening slot instead. My next class wasn't for another 2 hours, so since we lived close to campus, I decided to go back home in the meantime. When I got home, I found Sarah sitting in the living room, surrounded by boxes of books that had just been delivered. She had the look of someone who had just been caught cheating, which I suppose in a manner of speaking she had. The boxes were filled with first editions of various occult books and manuals written in various languages. They looked expensive. I confronted. She confessed to everything. She hadn't even signed up for any classes. When I pressed her on how she could afford to buy these books, she admitted she had used her student loan money. I asked her if she had even quit her security job. She looked at the floor and shook her head. I'm not proud of it, but I lost my temper. I yelled at her. She started crying. I began packing my things. She begged me to stay, but I was done with it all. I broke up with her and walked out with my stuff. I went and stayed with Peter until I could figure out my living situation. She called me, left voice messages. She called Peter, but I had nothing left to say to her. I moved on with my life. I graduated, got a job in my field, which required me moving to a new city. I lost touch with Vince and Kate. Partially it was just awkward since they were Sarah's friends. Peter said eventually Sarah stopped calling. That was the last I heard from Sarah for a long time. About 9 years ago, I met Jessica at my company. We started dating and I fell in love with her. Life was good. In time, I started to question if my experiences at Sarah's work had really gone down the way I remembered. Peter was the only one I kept in touch with from those days. I brought up the subject at the birthday party to him one more time, and this time he said he didn't remember anything. Without anyone to corroborate anything, I began to seriously question if I hadn't hallucinated the whole thing or something. Weren't the experts always saying that memory was incredibly unreliable? Jessica and I eventually got married. Peter was my best man. A year later, we welcomed our beautiful baby girl Emily into the world. I got promoted, so did she. We bought a house. I was doing well professionally. I had a beautiful family. We started going on family vacations to Europe and Asia. Have I mentioned how good my life was? Then 3 years ago, tragedy struck. Peter was murdered. It was a mugging gone wrong, a senseless death. My longest friend, I don't know how I would have made it without the support of my wife. But then she died too. It was a traffic accident. She had been coming home from work late one night when a drunk driver crossed the center median and collided with her in a head-on collision. They said if it was any consolation, she didn't feel any pain. I think that's probably bullshit they just say because they don't know what to say to a grieving spouse. It was a rough 2 years after that. Emily had reoccurring nightmares. She often would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. Luckily, it was a straight shot from the master bedroom down the hallway to my daughter's room, so I could quickly run over to comfort her, but it was hard, for both of us. There were times when something would remind us of Jess, and I'd just hold my daughter, both of us bawling our eyes out. They say time heals all wounds. That's bullshit. You just become numb to the pain over time. That said, there had been less crying lately. We were planning a vacation to Hawaii, and Emily was making friends at school again. We were living our lives again. 2 weeks ago, I got an email. It was Sarah. She said she had seen through a mutual acquaintance that Jessica had died. She apologized for not offering her condolences earlier and for how things had ended back then, for lying, and that she wanted to meet. Jessica had taught me to be a more forgiving man, so despite a voice deep in my gut that said not to, I agreed to meet her at a local diner for lunch. Time had not been kind to Sarah. She was thin, very thin, with heavy bags under her eyes. She smiled as I sat down and thanked me for meeting her. We exchanged idle pleasantries that were more fitting for work acquaintances than former lovers. The waitress came over and interrupted us just long enough to take our orders. We talked about nothing for a good 30 minutes as we ate our food. The conversation eventually gave way to an uncomfortable silence as we stared at our empty plates. Sarah began to speak, then stopped. She looked me straight in the eyes for the first time that day, and asked me if I remembered the little ghost girl from her old workplace. I rolled my eyes and asked if this was really where this was going. She could tell she was losing me already, so it came out in a flood, like she needed to dump it all on me. I wasn't really listening at this point, but I should have. Oh, how I should have. All I remember was she rambled about how the little girl was a demon, something about a doorway cracked, something about the night of the birthday party, about needing a name to seal a doorway, something about going back, a backwards something or another, something about it backfiring. I don't remember. When I started to get up to leave, she grabbed my hand to keep me there. She pulled out a folder with all sorts of papers in it. I was having flashbacks to the night of our intervention. We're the only ones left from that night. Her words were more a plea than a statement. She shoved a document in front of me. There was a column of names on the left. Both her name and mine were included in the list, along with Kate, Vince, Peter, Dieter, and Annika. I didn't recognize the other names, but I figured they were people who had been at the party. The right column had dates and status. Everyone, except for us, were listed as either dead or missing. She had Kate listed as a suicide with a date 2 years ago. Vince, it said, was missing as of a year ago, last seen hiking the Appalachian Crest Trail. Peter was listed as murdered 3 years ago. Dieter and Annika were both listed as just missing. I looked at Sarah, shaking my head. "This is sick, Sarah," I told her, as I pulled my hand from hers and stood up. I could see the desperation building up in her face. "Jessica's spirit came to me. She begged me to save you. How do you think I got your email address? Jessica gave it to me. It's not just you that's in danger, Emily too." She was practically begging, using my dead wife to manipulate me. I felt a flash of white-hot rage, but I reminded myself she was sick in the head. "You're sick, Sarah. You need professional help. Don't contact me again." My words were far calmer than I felt. I walked away. I could see in the reflection of the window as I left that she was slumped over at the table in defeat. Those were my last words to her, and they sting now when I remember them. A couple of days later, 2 cops showed up at my front door. They began asking me questions about Sarah, about our interactions that day. I answered them honestly and asked what was this all about. One of the officers said it was part of an investigation. I was suspicious of what that meant, and I asked if Sarah was in some kind of trouble. But the cops declined to answer any questions. I tried calling the number Sarah had given me, but there was no answer. A few days after that, there was a story in the local news that mentioned a woman had been found dead in a local motel, and that the police were investigating. It was the same hotel that she said she had been staying at. I felt a wave of guilt. If she had done something to herself, was it my fault? Should I have been gentler with her? I was still wrestling with these emotions a few days ago when my daughter came into my room, asking me to come help her buy a dress she had found online. She had her laptop in her room, so I followed her back. To my shock, the dress she had in the cart was identical to the one the little ghost girl had worn. It was just coincidence, I told myself. The dress was a relatively common-looking one after all, but given all that happened, I couldn't shake that feeling. I asked her why she wanted this particular dress. She said it was because it was a pretty dress, which I felt some relief at hearing. Then she added, it was the same dress her friend wears. The hairs on my neck went up at that last addition. Just as I was about to ask who this friend was, I heard a sound come from my bedroom. I looked up from the laptop, down the hallway, into my bedroom. To my abject horror, peeking out from behind the doorframe was the same little girl I had seen some 15 years ago. She then slid back behind the doorframe out of view. A chill ran down my spine. "Daddy, you can see my friend too?" my daughter asked excitedly. So I'm recording this to leave some record. I have no idea where to go for help. We're running, that's all I know. But where to, or how to protect my daughter, I haven't a clue. I should have listened. Now it's my turn to say I'm sorry, Sarah. I should have listened. You were right. I'm sorry. This concludes tonight's episode of Ghostly Stories. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the show. The story in my apology will continue in the next installment of Ghostly Stories. I have not yet decided whether I will be doing concurrent releases of Ghostly Japan and Ghostly Stories, or if I will be doing alternating releases. In either case, next week we will continue with Part 2 of Ghostly Japan, Paranormal Machida. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please consider hitting the like and subscribe. Have a wonderful evening, and see you in the next video.